The title that I gave to my lecture, my presentation, is The Art of Counterterrorism. And this sounds a little bit weird. I mean, how come? You're talking about a subject matter which has a very bad connotation. Terrorism. Terrorism is not a nice thing. Art is a beautiful thing. And again, Florence, it's the embryonic history of art. How can you combine the two, the art of counterterrorism? And I didn't invent the wheel. Actually, I just followed the steps of the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu that was talking and writing about the art of war. And I would argue that modern war is terrorism. And therefore, counterterrorism should be regarded as the art of counterterrorism. Now, when I say art, why do I use the term art and not say the profession, the expertise? Because I would argue that counterterrorism should reach to a level which is much higher than a profession and an expertise. It has to bring to the table a lot of academic approaches, academic tools, perspectives, a lot of experience. And also, I would say, something which is very common with artists, coming with their guts feeling, with their emotions, with their overview, world overview altogether. But we are in an academic institution, and I would like to show in my first slide that practically almost every field, every academic field that you have in mind has relevancy to terrorism. Psychology, sociology, political science, law, criminology, computer science, biology, chemistry, medicine, philosophy, theology, you name it, all has to do directly or indirectly with terrorism. And I would argue that it's the obligation of the academic institutions and the universities to get into this important subject matter and don't leave it just to the practitioners. I have a lot of respect to practitioners. I don't want to be a practitioner in counterterrorism because you have a lot of burden on your shoulder, a lot of responsibility. You're responsible for the life of people all over the world. But with all due respect that I have to them, I would say we, scholars, academicians, can bring to the table different perspectives, different tools, different experience, academic experience that will contribute to their efforts and make them better in their efforts. We need to define what is better in this regard, and we will do that during the lecture itself. So that's why I insist and argue that the art, the task of counterterrorism is a certain type of an art. Now, what is really, if I really need to crystallize the term art of counterterrorism, what do I mean by that? Almost in every field, every subfield of counterterrorism, you would find a lot of dilemmas. And we will speak about 5 dilemmas in my presentation today. Each one of those dilemmas are crucial and need to be solved. And when I say dilemmas, is some kind of competition between different policies, different practices, different doctrines, and you, as the artist of counterterrorism, need to find the right balances between those different contradictive doctrines altogether. The art of counterterrorism is finding those right balances, and that's what I'll try to do with you in this regard today. A little PR to my books never hurts. You saw one of them, the other one Liav was speaking about. I'm doing that not just for the PR itself, because everything that we will discuss right now here is being elaborated in those specific books. I would say that the first challenge, 1 out of 5 challenges that I would like to describe today, the first challenge is the challenge of understanding who is the opponent, who is the rivalry, who is the terrorist. Now it seems very clear. Well, don't we recognize terrorists? Don't we know what is terrorism altogether? Maybe during the Q&A, I don't want to get into it right now, but one of my fields, the first writings was on the definition of terrorism. And you might be surprised to know that there is no acceptable international definition of the term. What we all know is actually the opposite, the saying that seems so right. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, which actually gives us a message that everything is subjective in life. Everybody who's fighting against me is a terrorist. Anybody who's using the same activities, the same type of war against my enemy this is a freedom fighter. Well, I beg to differ, but I would leave it as an open question, and I beg you to drag me to that question during the Q&A session. But this is part of the answer of who's the enemy, who's the opponent, who's the rivalry. We need to define what is terrorism, and then we need to define who are the terrorists and what are the differences between those terrorists. And this is something I really want to zoom in the opening of my presentation today. And I would suggest to differ between three types of perpetrators of terrorism. The first type is being known under the title of lone wolves. Who's a lone wolf? A lone wolf is a terrorist who is an individual that, the definition that I use for that purpose, do not have any operational ties to a terrorist organization, i.e., he was never been recruited by a terrorist organization, he never been trained by a terrorist organization, he's never been sent to his mission by a terrorist organization. That's a lone wolf. Now, those lone wolves might have ties to terrorist organizations, not operational ties. Many of them, almost all of them, many of them are being inspired by a terrorist organization. If you would interview this terrorist before or even after he conducted the terrorist attack, and you would ask him, who are you? He would say, I'm a soldier of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whoever. He refers to himself as part of this or the other organization. Still, I define this individual as a lone wolf because he doesn't have operational ties to a terrorist organization. He was not sent to his mission and not getting any operational support from a terrorist organization. You'll understand why it's important in a minute. So that's the first type. The second type of perpetrators is what I would define as local independent network. Now, what I'm going to say would seem as a contradiction in terms, but this is a bunch of lone wolves, a group of lone wolves. How come? First of all, it's not one person, it's few people altogether. I still refer to them as lone wolves because they also do not have operational ties to any terrorist organization. They might be inspired by a terrorist organization. But this is a group. Usually, by the way, it's a very small number of people. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's it. They've been radicalized together. Usually we are talking about peers, friends, family members. The example I gave here is San Bernardino, a husband and a wife that have been radicalized together, decided to commit the attack together. They are being inspired by ISIS. They do not have any operational ties to this organization or any organization. The third type of terrorism, this is a different ballgame altogether. This is the organized terrorism. The organized terrorism is the traditional, classical terrorism that we all know. Terrorist attacks that are being conducted by terrorist organizations, cells of terrorist organizations. It could be 9/11 attack, as I gave an example. It could be Bataclan. It could be other attacks that have been planned, prepared, and executed by a terrorist organization, by people that have been recruited, trained, operated, and have been launched to their mission by a terrorist organization. Now, when we compare the two ends of this range of terrorist attacks, the lone wolf from one hand and to the organized terrorism on the other end, in reference to the lone wolf, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is that usually the attacks that are being conducted by lone wolves are quite limited in the consequences that they commit. Because I don't want to sound as underestimating the suffering of any victim of terrorism, but still, how much damage can one person cause? There are few exceptions. Nice was an exception, for example, the attack in Nice, that he killed dozens of people and injured hundreds of them. But most of the lone wolf's attacks are limited or conducting a limited number of casualties, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, 10 people. Organized terrorism, different ballgame. 9/11, think about the worst atrocity ever. All the terrorist attacks that are being organized by a terrorist organization, much more casualties altogether. That's the good news in reference to the lone wolf's attacks. The bad news, I would use the past term now, and I will explain why I use the past term in a few slides away, because what I'm going to say right now, we used to think like that a few months ago, a few years ago, but now we think differently. When I talk about the bad news in reference to lone wolf's attacks, we used to believe that intelligence is incapable of dealing with those types of attacks. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me double-click on intelligence for one moment. What is intelligence? Traditional intelligence. Traditional intelligence is based on two legs, which is HUMINT and COMINT. HUMINT is human sources intelligence. COMINT is communication intelligence. HUMINT, you have an agent in the room, and COMINT, you are listening to you're wiretapping, you're listening to the discussion between two or more people altogether. What's the common denominator for HUMINT and COMINT? One common denominator. There is a discourse. There is a discussion between at least two people that share a secret, and you would like to know what is the secret of the attack. They are planning the attack. So either you have a person in the room who reports that, or you are listening to the phone conversation. That's how intelligence traditionally, historically works. This is irrelevant to lone wolves. Why? Because there is no discussion. There is no sharing of information. There is one person who has been radicalized, and with his sick mind, he decided one day to conduct an attack. And he goes and wage a war, his own war. So traditional intelligence is incapable of dealing with that. I put that in brackets, and I would refer to that differently a few slides away. So that's the first challenge, to identify who's the perpetrator, because I would argue that when we talk about counterterrorism, when we talk about the measures that need to be conducted in reference to prevent those attacks, you need different measures to lone wolves, and to organized terrorists, and to local independent networks. Different types of activities. We'll talk about that. The second challenge is, once you understand who's the opponent, who's the enemy, who is the terrorist, is to understand the rationale of the opponent. Now, if you get out of this presentation today and you pick up the first person here in the campus or outside in Florence, and you would ask him one question: are terrorists rational actors? I tend to believe that most of them would argue, of course not. How could they be? They are lunatics. A person who's ready to strap himself with a suicide belt and kill himself, this is a rational behavior? They are all lunatics. I beg to differ. Terrorists, and I'm generalizing here, most of the terrorists are rational actors. But in order to justify that, let me speak about rationality. What is a rational behavior? What is a rational decision-making process? A rational decision-making process is a process in which one has different alternatives of behavior, that he needs to choose one type of behavior among many others. He calculates, this is the prism of the cost-benefit calculation, he's calculating the cost and benefits of each one of those alternatives, and he's choosing the alternative which he believes is more beneficial than costly to achieve the goal that he set to himself. That's a generic rational process. That's what you do every morning. That's what I do every morning. That's what the terrorist is doing every morning. The whole difference is that this prism of cost-benefit is different from one person to another person. It's different from one culture to another culture. It's different from one group of people to other. Because it's in the eye of the beholder. It's based on what? It's based on the culture of the person. It's based on the religion of the person. It's based on the experience and the history of the person. It's based on the interest of the person. So my rationale is different than Liav's rationale, although we have probably quite similar way of cost-benefit weighing. But our rationale is different than Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Furthermore, it's even more complicated than that. It's not just complicated to understand the rationale of the terrorist organizations. I would argue that there is no generic rationale for all the terrorists or the terrorist organizations. The rationale of ISIS is different than the rationale of Hezbollah, and the rationale of Hezbollah is different than the rationale of the PKK, or you name it, as any organization you have in mind. Why? Because they are bringing different perspective, different calculus of cost and benefits altogether. You know what? It's even more complicated than that. Because there is no one generic rationale of ISIS. The rationale of ISIS today, I would argue, is totally different than the rationale of ISIS 6 months ago or a year ago, when ISIS was a hybrid terrorist organization that controlled territory and population in Syria. His calculus of costs and benefit has to do with the population, with the services he needs to give them, with the funding that he needs to get, and so many other calculations that today he doesn't have anymore. Yes, other calculations, how to stay alive, how to still be relevant, how to win the competition with Al-Qaeda, different types of calculations that create the new cost-benefit analysis of ISIS. So when I see a counterterrorism expert who's telling me, I understand the rationale of the opponent, the rationale of the terrorist, and I'm saying, cool down. Because maybe you know the rationale today, but they are on a learning curve all the time. It's a dynamic phenomenon. It's changing. You cannot lay back and say, I got it, I know it all. No. Maybe you understand the rationale of ISIS or Al-Qaeda today, but it might be different in 3 months' time. That's why it's so interesting, the subject matter that we're dealing with. But it's even more complicated than that, and I will not complicate it more, I promise. Why it's more complicated? Because until now, I was speaking about the rationale of terrorist organizations. Well, it's something that maybe you can grasp. But what about the rationale of the lone wolves? It's much more complicated than that. How can we understand the rationale of the lone wolf? I want to show you now 4 pictures of 4 lone wolves that conducted the terrorist attack in Jerusalem, in Israel. And the common denominator that you would see is that the pictures have been taken different months during the last 2 years, 3 years. The picture has been taken immediately after they stepped civilians in the street. They were handcuffed and they are accompanied with police officers or soldiers to the police car. Probably they're going to spend their life in jail. That's the common denominator of those 4 pictures. But there is another common denominator, which you will see it in your own eyes. The smile on the face. All of them are smiling. By the way, not just Palestinians. Many of those lone wolves in Europe, the victims of those lone wolves reported that when they stabbed them, they saw a big smile on the face. Now, why is that? Why is this smile? We need to figure out, and I'm talking about scholars, I'm talking about academicians, we need to figure out what is the rationale, what is the cost benefit. I would like to argue that this smile is a reflection of their inner calculus of cost benefits. They are reporting to themselves right now, yes, we are going to jail. We probably are going to spend our life in jail. But in our calculus of cost benefit, what we did right now was the beneficial thing to do. Until we would understand how do they refer to that as the beneficial thing to do, we would never understand the rationale. I would give you a hint. It's not proven academically yet, but I'm working with my colleagues in Israel on that matter, trying to figure out. I think that one part of the explanation, it doesn't explain all the cases, but a big part of it has to do with the term honor. These guys believe that what they did right now was not just the beneficial thing to do, it was the honorable thing to do. That's the way that they have been educated. Again, regardless if it's Palestinians, if it's ISIS elements in Europe, if it's Al-Qaeda. What they report to themselves, that what we did right now is the honorable thing to do. This brings us back to many, many questions that scholars are working on today. And the question of narratives, counter-narratives, radicalization, de-radicalization, all has to do with this concept. Because if you would find a way to make it clear to them that this is not the honorable thing to do, by the way, you would not able to do it and I would not able to do it. The only one who is capable of doing that is people that they really respect, which are coming from their own culture, which are coming from their own religion. But if they would be brave enough to stand and say, guys, you got it all wrong. This is not the honorable thing to do. I'm a pundit, I'm a religious pundit, I'm a imam, a Muslim imam, and I'm telling you, I know the Quran from A to Z. And this is not what God is expecting you to do. Well, this is the kind of understanding that need to be understood and maybe would influence the calculus of cost and benefit, inner calculus of cost. We'll get back to that in a moment. Let me zoom in on the lone wolf phenomenon a little bit, not too much. Lone wolves are conducting every types of attacks. From sabotage, cocktail molotov, very common is stabbing, running down with their cars. We had in Israel also lone wolves that used bulldozers in the streets. They worked in construction or something. They started to run on people with bulldozers, shooting and ID bombings. The only type of terrorist attack which is missing here, and I won't get into it, is suicide attacks. Based on the research that we have found, suicide attacks, i.e., again, the definition of an attack which is dependent on the death of the perpetrator, that's what suicide attack is. Suicide attack is the suicide belt that the person put himself, and he knows very well that either he pressed the button, killing himself, and then he kills other, or he doesn't press the button, he doesn't die, but then nothing happens. That's what makes suicide attack different from all other high-risk attacks for those terrorists. Unfortunately, many scholars around the world, many decision makers around the world refers to lone wolves and all types of terrorism as suicide attacks. No, even if they want to die, it's not suicide attacks. Even if they prepare themselves to die, it's not a suicide attack. A suicide attack, you have to die in order to commit the attack. You cannot fulfill your mission without dying. Those types of attacks we didn't find any lone wolves conducting those types of attacks yet. Now, I'm using the term, seems to be a funny term, jihadi zombies. Now, why do I use zombies? Just because one reason. Because I want to take the sense of honor out of this activity. Zombies have no honor. They can have many other things, but no honor. And you could see the way that they act, which actually reminds this concept of zombies. I'll show you another jihadi zombie in Israel. You would see him coming from left to right with an orange t-shirt. This attack was conducted about 800 meters away from the campus of our university. And this jihadi zombie was coming and started to stab every person that was waiting to the public bus there. Now you would say, okay, this is an Israeli problem, so interesting, but not really our concern. Well, excuse me, this is a global phenomenon. This is a jihadi zombie from Britain that actually butchered the soldier Lee Rigby in the suburbs of London. You see the corpse lying there. Now this jihadi zombie, after butchering this soldier, you would expect that he would run away. He could have. He didn't. He was going to the corpse. He was mixing his hand with the blood of the victims, and he was asking nicely every person that has a cellular phone to take out his cellular phone and to record a video clip in which he explains why he did it. What is the rationale? Why this was the honorable thing to do? And it's not just Britain and Israel. This is another person. This is Zale Thompson that conducted this type of attack in United States. In New York City. And what he did, by the way, it's an Afro-American that converted to Islam. And I'll say something about that in a moment. And he actually took an axe and started to butcher NYPD officers in the streets. This is, you can find it in Australia, all over Europe, and other places altogether. It's the same type of an attack with the same rationale behind it. Now, I said that I wanted to say something about this attack. This is still ill-researched, but I believe that we see a beginning of a new generation of lone wolves and generation of terrorists, which is more dangerous than the previous one, because those are converts. We see more and more converts being engaged in those terrorist attacks. We saw it in Manchester. We saw it with the recent one in the parliament in London, and so on and so forth. Now, why it's more dangerous? First of all, it makes sense. It makes sense because a person that is jumping from one religion to another religion wants to show that he is more dedicated than others. He doesn't really understand Islam whatsoever. But then, what is the ultimate way by what he was educated to show that he is dedicated? You want to say something?
Yes.
Please.
Jihad zombies and terrorism. What about if they are just psychos?
That's a great question. We at ICT, and I promised that I would say something about ICT. ICT is my institute, which I founded 22 years ago. It's one of the leading, if not the leading, center of excellence, academic center of excellence for counterterrorism. We do a lot of work. We have a few Horizon 2020. We just won with different consortiums on different aspects of terrorism altogether. But one of the research that we are actually doing right now is interviewing those lone wolves in the jail system. Now, not just interviewing them. We brought psychologists which are fluent in Arabic, and we interview them. And we are not interested in intelligence kind of questions. We're interested in one thing, trying to understand their mind, trying to understand their psychological profile. And we have those psychologists and psychiatrists who are sitting with them days by days. By the way, they volunteer to the mission. They're ready, happily, to speak with them. And you actually have a point here. We didn't finalize. We're at the last stage of the research. The first findings we didn't publish, but we introduced them in our international conference 2 weeks ago. And one of the most interesting findings is that 67% of those 34 lone wolves that we interviewed in the jail are having clinical psychological problems.
So she has a point.
So there are, some of them psycho, some of them has this... exactly.
So what is the difference between terrorist and psychopath?
Okay. Bear with me with this question. You know what the difference between good question and outstanding question? Good question is a good question. Outstanding question is a good question which you have a slide afterwards that you can show. So you have an outstanding question. And I will get into that in 2 slides away, okay? Now, let me go back to what I've said before. You remember I said that we used to believe that intelligence is incapable of dealing with those lone wolves. We used to believe because we have found that intelligence agencies around the world today find something that can replace HUMINT and COMINT. It's called OSINT, Open Sources Intelligence. Many of those lone wolves report their intention to conduct the attack over the social networks before they are conducting the attack. Why? Because there is no meaning for their attack. If they would not cling it, it will be just a psychopath activity. Now, although this is part of the answer, although many of them are psychopaths or having other psychological problems, they are interested in 2 things. A, being killed by a cop. It's a suicide by a cop, okay? They don't really want to commit suicide. They want that they will be killed because they want to give a statement. And B, that they will be remembered as somebody that did an outstanding deed, actually altruistic activity, giving their life for a cause. They would probably commit a suicide in any other society by themselves. Here they have a chance to die as they really want to die, but also to be glorified for what they did. Now, they need to publish that because there is no meaning for the glorification if you don't cling that to those causes or those reasons that you explain them. Now, give you some examples. This is a lone wolf that conducted an attack. Just before the attack, he started to put on his Facebook wall, he started to put propaganda of ISIS. Fadi Alun conducted the attack in October 2015, and he writes in his Facebook before the attack, "In the name of Allah, the merciful and compassionate, O Allah, today I decided to achieve shuhada, I decided to become a martyr, and a victory to Allah." I mean, this is an intelligence warning. No other way to look at that. The internet is also being used in order to incite those guys, to push them to do this activity and to teach them how to do it effectively, how to buy a regular knife and to snitch that in a way that if you stab with this snitch knife, there is no way to repair the veins and the dye. It will be a critical outcome at the end of the day. The imam who's explaining how to stab with the knife or how to butcher a soldier from behind and so on and so forth. After the attack, those terrorist organizations are taking advantage of the fact, although they are not responsible for that, they are not operationally responsible for that attack, they're taking responsibility of the attack, and they publish the picture of the attacker, and they actually create a model of imitations for others. So what we see is that the social network factor, the internet, the World Wide Web, is practically encapsulate the whole process from starting with the incitement, the radicalization process of the individual. He makes the decision to conduct the attack. Before conducting the attack, he justifies it and gives a political statement. He creates an model imitation, and going back again, this serves as fertilizer for further incitement. This perpetuum mobile type of activity creates an epidemic outcome at the end of the day. By the way, this has pushed many researchers to be engaged today in monitoring the social networks. Those two Horizon 2020 that we won has to do exactly with that, with building algorithms to try to find the early stages of radicalization process over the internet. And we are one group among many others which I'm familiar, which is doing them. And it creates a lot of problems. I'll talk about the problems when I'll talk about another dilemma in a moment. The good news is that this is, of course, transparent. Everybody can see that, and therefore you can use it if you know how to use it. The third challenge, because Liav showed me that I have only 10 more minutes. The third challenge I want to speak with you about is decoding the counterterrorism equation. Now, if you can decode this equation, you are an artist of counterterrorism. I'm kidding, of course. Who knows what's this equation altogether? What is the equation of terrorism? Very simple mathematical equation. Terrorist attack is a combination of motivation, a factor of motivation, multiple with a factor of operational capability. When you have a group of people that has on one hand motivation to conduct the attack, by the way, regardless which type of motivation, it could be nationalistic, it could be separatistic, it could be extreme ideology, communism, fascism, anarchism, it could be religious political grievances, creating a caliphate state, and so on and so forth. When they have motivation, they believe the best way to achieve their political goal, political motivation, they have a political goal, is by using terrorism, and they have the operational capability that allows them to materialize the motivation, then a terrorist attack or a terrorist campaign would occur. Why multiple? Because if one factor is zero, the whole equation is zero. If they have motivation but no capability, there won't be an attack. If they have capability and no motivation, there won't be an attack. So from that, you can conclude what is the formula of counterterrorism. Now, the formula of counterterrorism is the same formula. If you want to be effective in counterterrorism, you either need to lower down the motivation to find solutions to their grievances, or to lower down the operational capability, because as I said before, if one factor is there and the other is missing, there won't be an attack. I would argue that the ultimate solution for terrorism is dealing with both factors at the same time, lowering down motivation and operational capability. Easier said than done. Why is that? Because there is a contradiction between the two. In the literature of counterterrorism, we call it the boomerang effect in counterterrorism. If you are trying to lower down the operational capability of the terrorist, how can you do that? There is only one way. You need to use operative measures against them. You need to kill them if necessary. You need to arrest them. You need to confiscate their funds. You need to destroy their weapons. When you do all of the above, as effective as you are, like it or not, you raise their motivation to retaliate. That's the boomerang effect in counterterrorism. How to solve this dilemma? That's the art of counterterrorism.
Before we go to the fourth challenge, there is one question that
Sure.
needs to go to leave.
Sure.
I'm sorry for rushing, but I have to leave.
You can watch the video afterwards.
By 3:30, and I want to ask this question.
Please.
Assume I agree with everything you have said so far. It leaves me with a big question. How do you distinguish terrorism from other types of violent crime?
So that's the definition.
And my background is that I was the first United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism from 2005 to 2011. And I visited Israel as a mission to Israel to speak to visited your institute.
Yes.
And established definitions of terrorism at the international level, they have two alternative intent elements of terrorism: to create fear amongst the general public, or to compel the government to do something or refrain something. If I believe everything you have said, I might still say these acts, like the stabbings, are not terrorism, because you can't prove that it was done to create fear amongst the general population. It was done to protect one's honor, to realize one's mission on the planet, to get closer to God. But do you prove the element of creating fear or compelling the government?
The answer is no. It doesn't have to do with the definition of terrorism whatsoever. Okay. And the definition, the definition that I use, actually you dragged me to that question, so I really now want to speak about the definition of terrorism, but this doesn't count in my 8 minutes that I have.
Bear in mind that you must speak in how many minutes?
Okay, I'll do it rapidly. The terrorism definition that I use is the following one. Terrorism is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilian targets by non-state actor in order to achieve political ends. Period. Now, many of those attacks of terrorism has other factors. And I agree that many of the terrorist attacks are intended to terrorize the society. Others are trying to compel. I don't care about that. That's not what describes the phenomenon. The phenomenon is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians for political causes. Now, let me refer to that. Many states would not agree with me, including Israel, because I exclude deliberate attack against military targets. Killing a soldier, even Israeli soldier, is not terrorism. Of course, as an Israeli, I don't accept it. I will fight back. I will try to prevent it. But this is not terrorism. Terrorism is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians. That's one thing that we need to see. The other thing, some people would say, but why do you exclude that to sub-state, to non-state actors? I mean, can state not do terrorist attacks? Of course they can. Actually, states can make much more harm than sub-states, than non-state organizations. They can kill much more civilians intentionally for political causes. So why shouldn't we define that? Because we don't need to define that as terrorism, because the international humanitarian law, the IHL, already defined that when a state deliberately attacks civilians, it's either a war crime or a crime against humanity. Terrorism is the equivalent of a war crime or a crime against humanity. That's the way I refer to it.
This is all clear. And you're not alone in the sense that there's a long tradition in political science that defines terrorism as a specific for political violence. But the legal definitions...
I agree. I agree. I know. I'm not coming from the legal...
definitions say irrespective of whether there is a political...
You are so right about that. And you know how I solve that?
Yeah.
Because if there is a crave in me, this is try to persuade the international community to adopt this definition. And I succeeded many things in my life, nothing in this respect. I didn't succeed to, and then I asked myself this year, why? Why didn't I succeed? I have contacts, I meet decision makers, I know all the important people at the UN. Why I didn't succeed? Because it's not in the interest of states to adopt this definition. Because then you can have, in beautiful places like Florence, international summits when you have Putin, Shmutin, and all the rest raising their hands up in the air, and we are all against terrorism. But now let's define what is terrorism. Let's see if Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, or the Chechens are terrorists, or the Kurds are terrorists, or the Uyghurs are terrorists, and so on and so forth. It's convenient for them that they don't have the definition of terrorism. You know who's my partner? Who should be my partner? They don't know yet that they are my partners, but they would be. The social network providers. Facebook, Twitter, Google. Why? Because they are now being approached by those states, and they are claiming that you don't do what is necessary. You don't censor incitement for terrorism over the Facebook. And they go back to those states and say, fine, you want us to censor? We are ready to censor. But tell us what is terrorism. They don't know what to tell them. So we should come and give them this tool to work with it in their activity.
I understand, and that's a logical position. I just want to add that besides the interest of states, there are people who like the kind of legal definitions because they are good for the rule of law and good for human rights. So people like me, we want to have a narrow as possible definition of terrorism
I think
in
that-
order to prevent abuse.
I believe that my definition is the narrowest, and I believe that my definition protects the lives of innocent people much more than any other definition, which everybody can play with it any way they want. And by the way, as you know, there is a definition of the UN, but there is a different definition of the FBI and a different definition of the CIA. And I know more than 120 official definitions, legal definitions. That's not the way to deal with it. But maybe we'll speak about that later on another occasion, because you are in a hurry. And I wanted to say at the ending of my presentation, which is not the ending of my presentation, I wanted to say that each and every one of you are invited to be in touch with us on fields that might interest you. If it's border control and immigration and terrorism, if it's legal aspects of that, if it's technology and AI, which I will refer to that in a moment as well in reference to counterterrorism and so on and so forth. But thank you for asking the question. The fourth, just one. Here I go back to I promised that I have a slide. That's the slide I want to show you. What motivates the lone wolves? And that's the outcome, by the way, of the research that we have conducted. And I would say that there are many, many aspects that motivate them. In 67% of those that we have asked them, they have this psychological or psychiatric problem. But it always has to come with something. And something is one of those issues. It could be ideological reasoning. It could be personal, economical distress, interpersonal, family fight, and so on and so forth. The honor factor that we have discussed. If they see Swiss government prevent the veil from the Muslim women, that might intrigue their honorable thing to do. And of course, psychological and mental disorder. Now, in order to understand that, think about a bath or any container that can contain, say, liquid, water for that matter. I would argue that this container is the psychological profile of each one of those perpetrators. And this container is being filled by different sources of liquid. Now, if he's really has a severe mental illness, so 80% of the water in this bath would come from the mental illness, but still he would need the 20% there. Other cases, they are not suffering, at least 36% or more doesn't suffer from mental illness, so it doesn't feel any liquid in this bath, but other parts are feeling this bath. But at the end of the day, by the way, how tall the bath is based on your psychological structure. If you are very well structured, if you live with yourself in the right manner, and so on and so forth. So each one has a different type of wall, each person. There are triggers that can intrigue them and practically lower the wall. If they watch TV and they see an Israeli soldier that humiliating a Palestinian woman in a border control, this might intrigue immediately. The lowering down this wall of the bath, and there is a spillover. The spillover is the attack. He decides to take the knife and conduct the attack. Now, you remember what we've said? Terrorism is a combination of motivation, multiple operational capability. It's true, but not in lone wolf attacks. Why? Because there is no meaning of operational capability in lone wolf attacks. The operational capability has to do with going to the kitchen, taking a knife. Everybody has this capability, or taking the car keys and running down on people. Everybody has this capability. So in lone wolves, the case of motivation, understanding this concept, the Beth concept, is much more important than any other type of attack. Because this is the whole explanation for the phenomenon at the end of the day. Not the operational side of it, but the motivation side of it. But all of that, all those individuals are living under constant incitement. In the Palestinian arena, it will be Palestinian incitement, but in the global arena, it will be Al-Qaeda, it will be ISIS, it will be Dawah activists, it will be radical imams that incite them. Of course, The vast majority are not. Don't get me wrong. I don't put the blame on any religion. From my point of view, this path is relevant for Palestinian Muslim terrorists, but for Jewish terrorists as well, and for Christian terrorists for that matter. It works the same way. The next dilemma, the fourth dilemma, is the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. Practically, that has to do a lot with the Schuman Center that you are engaged in governance and democracy. And I would say that modern terrorism actually identify the fragile soft bellies of democracy and misuse them for that purpose. What is really the dilemma? The dilemma is, the counterterrorism dilemma, is the dilemma between being effective in counterterrorism and guarding liberal democratic values at the same time. You could be most effective in counterterrorism if you disregard liberal democratic values, if you don't care about liberalism, if you don't care about democracy. You can be most liberal and democratic if you don't suffer from terrorism and you don't want to do anything to stop that. But at the end of the day, most of the states around the world, in the democratic world, needs to find the right balance. And what does it mean, the right balance? The right balance, it means that you need to understand that you would sacrifice some of your values in order to have enough efficiency in guarding the lives of the people. And you would have to sacrifice some of your efficiency in counterterrorism in order to stick to your fundamental liberal democratic values. Now, politicians cannot do that. Security services cannot do that. Scholars can do that. Scholars can find the right balance. Scholars which understand the field of counterterrorism can find the right balance and give this guidance to the decision makers around the world. And if you think it's a problem, historical problem, I would argue that it's a current problem and it's going to grow in the future because you have much more democracies that are having this challenge that was very natural to Israel 20 years ago or 10 years ago, but now it's spread all over the world. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is the same phenomenon. But there are many common denominators and many experiences that we had in Israel, some of them good, some of them bad, that you can learn from that in order to find the right balances that we're talking about. Before that, I said that I want to say something about AI and technology. This is something that I'm engaged right now, and I'm working with Liav on that matter as well. Because, what I've explained before, because of the fact that the lone wolves, maybe one of the only ways to be effective, to deal with them in prevention, not security, prevention, is by having an early warning through the social networks. What we see more and more intelligence services around the world being engaged in AI, in big data, and machine learning. I read an outstanding article, which I recommend everybody to read about a month ago, of Henry Kissinger. The title was something along the line of, he was talking about the AI phenomenon, machine learning, deep learning, and the title was something along the lines of the end of enlightenment.
Yeah, it was the title.
It was, yeah.
The end of the enlightenment.
The end of the enlightenment. And he criticized that, and very interesting to read that, but I was very interested because he finished his article by saying, and everything I describe here is much more problematic when it has to do with counterterrorism and national security affairs. Why? Because then the decision makers doesn't have any inhibitions in using those technologies that intrude to the privacy, that conduct a lot of problems. And what you see today is more and more agencies which are engaging with AI and machine learning. And I'm telling you, I am concerned, and I'm not coming from the human rights point of view. I'm coming from the counterterrorism. Although I'm very well alluded to human rights, and I believe that I believe in those concepts, but I don't see myself as a human rights activist. Still, I'm very concerned with this new process that is happening today as we speak globally, around the world, in Europe, in the United States, in Israel, anywhere you go. Because what you see, think about that. And let's go back to the definition of terrorism for one moment in this regard. Kissinger is writing in his article that there was some kind of an experiment that was done by taking two computers, chat booths, and teaching them to speak one to each other in a friendly speech. They call it a Thai. The name of the experiment was Thai. The Thai chatbot was giving one order. You should speak with the other computer in a polite, non-aggressive manner as a 19-years-old girl. It was a very short period of time after that those two chatbots becoming very aggressive. And they stopped the discussion. And Kissinger is asking the question, why is that? The answer that Kissinger gave, the answer is because there is no international acceptance of what is aggressiveness. In one culture, this behavior would be regarded as aggressive, and in other culture, it would not be regarded as aggressive. You cannot teach the machine to be non-aggressive if you do not agree. And I would say the same thing about terrorism. You cannot teach the machines to identify terrorists if you do not have an international agreement on what terrorism is altogether. And that's why it's even more important today when those AI, machine learning, is getting into this subject matter. But let's give another example. And just a moment. Let's give another example. And the other example would be, there is a company today which I was introduced to them, and they claim that they can identify terrorists by their faces. They take billions of pictures of people around the world and all the pictures of non-terrorists in the history, and they create algorithms that they cannot explain. That's the worst type of machine learning, which the scientists cannot explain the outcome. They just can say that we have 90% of success, but they cannot explain. When you would ask them, okay, so you're saying that this guy is a terrorist. Why? Because he's winking all the time, because he has a mustache and beard. What is it? They cannot explain, but the machine is right. Now, if you would walk in Florence and the police officer will approach you and say, what's your name, Liav? We arrest you because you are a terrorist. I swear, I'm not a terrorist. I don't even think about being a terrorist. Really, we believe you. But you're going to be a terrorist because you have the face of the terrorist. Now, we are going there. We are going there. And that's the time in which scholars and academicians around the world, I think, human rights activists with counterterrorism experts need to sit down and create a guideline. What should be permitted and what should not be permitted in this kind of activity. But I promised before that, I promised, okay? You wanted to say something, Theo?
No, this is related?
No, she.
It is.
Yeah.
So please.
But you can wait. It's okay.
No, it's fine, fine.
On your opinion, does religion help with terrorism?
Does religion?
Helps in terrorism?
No doubt. No doubt. Let me explain that.
How?
I'll give you an example. In my view, there is no good religion and bad religion.
We are talking in general.
I'm talking in general. I'm talking about religions. Okay. Now, religion could be. I'm as you see, I'm a Jew, but I'm not an Orthodox Jew. So I believe in God, but I don't believe in all. I'm being taped, so I won't say exactly what I think about all the rest around that. Okay. I believe that religion, any religion, could be the most beautiful thing on earth, because religion creates a set of values. Islam, Christianity, Judaism create a set of values that tells the people from ancient times until this moment what is right and what is wrong, what should be the behavior and what shouldn't be the behavior. That's the beautiful side of it. But religion could be also a very terrible thing if it's being misused. Now, when you have a blind belief in an ultimate sovereign, which is not the people, it's not democracy. By the way, I had a discussion with Condoleezza Rice on that matter many years ago, and I was arguing that democracy and the caliphate state can never be associated together. Because there is a contradiction, internal contradiction between the most embryonic thing. Who is the sovereign? Is the sovereign the demos? Is the people? Or the sovereign is Allah, is God? So when you have people with bad intentions, which are and they have the religious authority, misusing those religious concepts, they can motivate people to do the most extreme atrocities on earth. regardless if they would stay alive after that, if they would die, they promise them life after death, and so on and so forth. Again, in any religion. And that's why I do say terrorism is not necessarily always connected to religion. We had so many other terrorists around the world being motivated by socio-economical reasoning, by grievances, by... No, but I want to put it in the big frame, by socio-economical, by nationalistic, by separatistic, by extreme ideologies, but also by religion. This era, the last 2 decades, most of terrorism around the world is being motivated by religious grievances. In my view, false religious grievances, not real one. I don't think that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi really represents Islam. I really don't believe it. I think that 1,500,000,000 Muslims around the world, the amount of people in Islam that really believes in those Salafist jihadist concepts that Zawahiri, Bin Laden, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi believes in, it's a very, very, very small but dangerous minority. And, but we should not turn a blind eye to that fact.
We have to finish, so I have 5 minutes. But I want to just one point. So to connect the AI thing that you mentioned before, one of the things that we have also discussed, Boaz and I, so now the algorithms, and this is connecting the counter-terrorism to things that we also do at the border control and border security. So there was a cover story in The Economist a few months ago. Psychologist from Stanford University who had this algorithm that can identify accuracy of 86% whether the person is gay or straight. And this was all over, and there are lots of methodological issues, but it brought to the attention the power of algorithm. Facebook now has algorithm to identify the suicide, people before the suicide, the way they interact on Facebook. And there is an algorithm which you can identify tendency to violence in more than 80% of accuracy. Now there's a bigger challenge here for law enforcement people when it comes to borders. Imagine that a few years ago you have those algorithms, 95% accuracy of tendency to violence. So you put them at the borders so that people, before they enter the country, they go into those algorithms. Or maybe you don't put them on the border, but if a person has some suspicions based on traditional ways of counter-terrorism, and he or she claims that he has never been any involved, do you give him or her a way to appeal to the technology? Maybe not as a first instance, but as kind of an appealing instance. So those things were kind of the AI and deep learning and all. They are raising big questions which are connecting counter-terrorism to questions of law enforcement, border control, etc. 5 last minutes.
Definitely. Okay, so I'll be very brief. It's the fifth and the last challenge that I want to share with you, is the tension and finding the right balances between awareness in counterterrorism and resilience in counterterrorism. Awareness is one of the most important factors. I mean, bless you. If I would have been asked, and I'm being asked time and again, how come Israel is quite good in counterterrorism? So I would say Israel has good intelligence, good operative capabilities, but the key factor is the public awareness. I was born in Israel, I'm 7th generation, my family is 7th generation Israeli. I was born and raised in Israel. And I'm aware to my surrounding, I cannot help it. I was briefing an American senator in the Congress building about a situation in the Middle East. It was lunchtime, we did it at the cafeteria, and somebody left a suitcase next to us. And I was briefing him, but my mind was on this suitcase, and I stopped the briefing after a while and said, Mr. Senator, do you see? Somebody left a suitcase here. So he was looking at that and said, oh, yes, yes. And that's it. I couldn't speak anymore because my mind was, maybe this is a bomb, but he dismissed that. Now, if you don't believe me, try to take your bag and leave it in the center of Tel Aviv. And let's see how long would it take until a civilian would notify that, would see that, would call the police, and your bag will be blown away. I believe it will be 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Try to do it in Florence and see what's the difference in the level, the range of awareness in this regard. The problem is, and it was mentioned by our colleague before, the problem is that if you're too much aware to your surrounding, you are playing into the hands of the terrorists. Because the terrorists in general are interested to terrorize. They want to spread fear and anxiety. Now, if you are too much aware and you see a terrorist behind every curtain, then the outcome is that you are being paralyzed. You are not touring around the world. You are not doing your day-to-day activity. So you need to be resilient. There is this tension between resilience and awareness. So 2 anecdotes, and I conclude with that. The first anecdote, I gave a course to police officers in the United States, and to explain to them the awareness, that this typical awareness of the Israelis, I said, take for example mall security. You have mall security and we have mall security. You have entrance control, we have entrance control. You have guards at the entrance control, we have guards at the entrance control. You're checking the bags of the people at the entrance control, we're checking the bags of the people in the entrance control. But we're checking the bags of the people who's getting into the mall, you're checking the bags of the people who's getting out of the mall. Because we're thinking about terrorists and you're thinking about thieves. It's a different mentality, it's a different awareness. The last anecdote, and I'm concluding with that, is the following one. During the 90s, we had a severe wave of suicide attacks. After the Oslo Accords, the peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians were signed in 1992 and 3. We started to have severe suicide attacks coming from Hamas that wanted to end this process altogether. We had buses being blown away every second week. And then it was Thursday afternoon, 4 p.m. I think it was 94. There was an attack, a suicide attack in Tel Aviv. Many casualties, and I'm getting a phone call from an American journalist. And he's asking me the regular questions after attacks that you're asking a counterterrorism expert. Who do you think is responsible for this attack? Why now? What did they wanted to achieve? And I answer all the questions. And then he surprised me with the question that I didn't expect. And he said, and what are you going to do about this attack right now? I said, what do you mean, what are you going to do? Me as Boaz Ganor or Israel as a state? No, you personally as Boaz Ganor, what are you going to do about this attack? So I was thinking for one moment and I answered him, right now, immediately after the attack, I'm going to fight terrorism. He said, really, what are you going to do? He thought that I'm taking a knife between my teeth and going to slaughter Palestinians or something. I said, look, this is Thursday afternoon. Remember, I was much younger back then. This is Thursday afternoon, 4 p.m. Every Thursday afternoon at 4:30, I play basketball with my friends. Now, I'm not in the mood to play basketball. There are dozens of people that died in Tel Aviv. Maybe we don't know the names yet. Maybe family members of mine, maybe friends of mine. I'm not in the mood to go and play basketball. But my civilian answer to the terrorists, showing the resilience in counterterrorism, is practically to go and play basketball, not letting the terrorists changing my day-to-day activity, my leisure time activity, my life altogether. As an outcome of that, he wrote an article and he put a caricature of mine in the article, which I'll show you now, and I will conclude with that. I think it's flattering caricature, fighting terrorism on the basketball court. Thank you very much.